Yeah, I know every other vlogger says they're brilliant tyres. I didn't find them brilliant. Let's roll the intro. How much did I pay you for that intro? How much? I could have done that myself. It lasted about a second. Well, I fitted some Michelin Road 6 to my Triumph Daytona 1200. And I have to say, when I initially went out on the road, I thought, yeah, they're okay, but just okay. When I first fitted them, I found this bike got quite flighty. Dropped into the corners too fast for me. Wasn't to my liking. Okay, I was used to a kind of sport touring tyre, BT023 from Bridgestone. But I did think it made this big heavy bike too flighty in the corners. What could I do about it? Well, on a lot of bikes, you can do nothing about it. So I needed to change the stance of this bike to get the handling I wanted. But in order to do that, I needed to find out where my base level was. Out for a good few rides in the country, around some twisty roads, around some bends, all that sort of stuff, just to see how the bike was handling and what it was I didn't like about it. And this is where I found it a bit too flighty for me, a bit too quick to turn in, and I want to slow that down ever so slightly. So I knew what my goal was, so I knew I needed to lift the front end of that bike. Yeah, I know every other vlogger says they're brilliant tyres. I didn't find them brilliant. On these old Daytonas, the rear shock's buried away in there, so changing the rear preload, that was a definite non-runner, and it's set up for about 25% sag, and I don't want to change that really, because the load on this bike never changes, and I want to leave that preload where it is. So what I can do, because my bike has a front preload adjuster, all I was able to do is increase the preload, bring the front end of that bike up ever so slightly. It took that flightiness out of the steering immediately. Brilliant. That had that bike steering exactly as I wanted it to steer. So I spent a couple of 100 miles adjusting the bike to get it to suit me and those new tyres. These Road 6s, Michelin Road 6s, they act totally different than the BT03s that are on there. I don't know whether it's profile, the material, whatever it is, but they do. It doesn't matter, they do. So I can adjust these for my preference by that front preload. So that's brilliant. Let's do that now and get on with it. Right, I didn't film it all because I needed two hands. Right, that's both sides done. So I've added one notch of front preload, both sides of the forks. That would have lifted that front end slightly, and this is going to slow the steering down ever so slightly, and hopefully take the flightiness out of that steering. I may need to add another one, but we'll see. We'll just do it one at a time. I've done a couple of 100 miles in it now. I've mucked around. I've gone to an extra 2 rings of front preload to bring that front end up. Ended up going back down to 1 ring. That still left me with a really nice handling bike. And the way I wanted it to handle, without being too flighty, but without it slowing the steering down too much either, which would have been a negative consequence. And I made it to my favourite cafe for a cup of coffee and a piece of cake. I got to stop eating that cake. So now, with my Road 6s, I really like the Road 6s on this bike. And I really like the wet weather grip on it. It's funny, I wasn't thinking so much about the new wet weather grip I had on the new tyres until I got this handling right, because that was always bugging me. So once I got the handling right on these tyres, or to my preference anyway, it was then I started thinking about the wet weather grip and how well these tyres were doing. And they were doing a great job. I really felt like I was getting some nice braking out of them, nice traction, and a lot of confidence. So yeah, so I'm glad I fitted them in the end. Now, I know there might be some eagle-eyed amongst you saying, Look at your front preload, it's wound right off. It's no wonder your bloody steering's a bit flighty. The nose is on the floor of this bike. Well, it isn't, you see, because some time back I swapped out my Triumph springs for some Wilbur supplied springs. The original Triumph springs were actually a triple rate spring, and you can see the triple rate in the spring spacing here, and the rest of the spring here. But the overall spring rating was quite weak, well, for my weight anyway. Shut it, we've been through this. So I have a stronger spring set in the front of this, which has actually brought my preload adjustment right back to the edge. So I've just taken a little bit of that front sag out of it to give me that steering that I was looking for. I don't have the luxury of doing that on the Daytona 660 because there's no front preload, which is a shame actually. So I've got to make a compromise. Let's say I've decided my sag target is 25% on the rear with that preload. I might then have to make a compromise on that just to keep changing that rear preload to get my handling right and just accept the sag value I end up with. Now it's going to be somewhere that or thereabouts, but it's not as flexible as a bike with front preload adjustment. And if I find those Road 6s quite flighty for this bike, I'd actually be able to do nothing about it because there's a swing arm position sensor under here. It sees where the rear swing arm is and the bike's electronics decide on the preload, and I have no input into that apart from going high and low, but they're not for kind of regular road riding. So funnily enough, the bike with all the bells and whistles suspension is the one I can least adjust to make amends for a different tyre. The characteristics of that new tyre set are going to be take it or leave it on this bike. Now, just to say, I run Michelin Anarchy Adventures on this, and I love them on this bike. I think they're perfectly suited to it. Had it been the Suzuki GSX 1000 GX, I actually can, because they have a manual preload adjuster down on the front, so you can just change that to preload at the front and raise or lower that bike at the front end. Or if I hadn't got any adjustment there, I can offset the automatic rear preload up or down a couple of notches in the software. So there we are. You put new tyres on your bike and you're not happy with the handling, muck around with your preload a bit, see if you can improve it. More to your liking anyway. See, the funny thing is, see this 2004 Ninja 250? There's not even a preload adjustment on the rear shock. You can do nothing with this little baby, but it's a great little bike anyway.